So let's start the panel with a gut check. When you look at Seattle right now, what is one story about the city that is widely believed, but you think it's fundamentally wrong? And I'll just let folks jump in.
It is on. Okay. Well, I have the pleasure of actually having we just did some polling at The Stranger. So we got to disprove something that is widely believed to be true. There's this definitely big business narrative that Seattleites are one new tax hike away from fleeing the city, that everyone kind of hates to be here, it's crime-ridden, who wants to live in a city like this? Turns out about 3/4 of Seattleites really like it here. So
tax fatigue, and it's dangerous here. Yeah, I'll second that one.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think it's the Seattle freeze thing. I have never experienced it. And when I meet newcomers, they seem so happy along Hannah's Point to be here. And especially, I live in the best part of Seattle, in the south part of Seattle. And I feel like everybody there is really welcoming and curious and interested. So I would say the Seattle freeze.
Yeah, I guess I would say I think it's kind of the idea of what Seattle culture is. I really always kind of cringe when people say, Seattleites wear, plaid and they dress in Carhartts and they do all these different things. And it's very subjective, right? Based on where you live and who you are. And I think it kind of leaves out where Florangela and I live, which is a very different Seattle than I think is that stereotype. And I think when we talk about what Seattle is, I think we need to broaden our lens a little bit. I know a lot of people who are very fashionable that are maybe don't fit that mold, and I think that we need to be a little bit more inclusive when we talk about that.
we also still don't live in the 90s.
So we're here to talk about the media ecosystem, which we're all part of, and I think there is, a correct, more or less, narrative that the media is shrinking, local media in particular. If you disagree with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But my question is, if the media ecosystem stays on its current trajectory, who do you think will become invisible or more invisible? What communities, neighborhoods, topics get covered less, or only when something goes wrong there? And let's start with Florangela.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is arts and culture. Arts and culture, I've worked in a lot of different newsrooms and a lot of different media, and arts and culture is consistently the department that is the most vulnerable in news orgs. And I feel like it is undoubtedly one of the most powerful because of the creativity. It's a business, the independence, the messaging, all of it. All of the things that we like to say that we're proud of Seattle, you can find in the arts and culture, and it spills into, except for sports, but you can see what's been done to high school sports coverage if you've been around it long enough. High school sports coverage is not present anymore. And I would say also, geography, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about that, is the challenges of getting out to different corners of just Seattle proper. The smaller the newsrooms are, that means the fewer people who have a means, who are living in these neighborhoods or communities, or who are able to get out there and then have the trust and the familiarity and the context to be able to accurately and completely cover issues. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we are seeing kind of across the board in places as they lose their local media landscape is kind of the PRization of journalism, that you'll mostly see like a regurgitation of a press release, and that starts to feel like, well, this is information, and you start to kind of lose your footing as to what a press release is versus what the press is. And I think we see that in politics as much as we see that in the arts. That journalists are meant to be your guide through information that shouldn't be that one-sided, and we lose that the thinner that our like local media landscape gets.
Yeah, and I would I would agree with all of that, and I would also just add that I think communities of color, marginalized communities, people who are trans, immigrants, non-English speakers, I think those are the folks that are most at risk of having their voices hidden in a landscape where the media shrinks. And I think we all can do better all the time. I know I can do better all the time at making sure that I'm amplifying those voices and making those stories come to the forefront. But I think that, you know, as media declines or shifts, that's something we need to be vigilant about all the time.
Yeah, and I think just as just to kind of second all of that, is that, you know, an accountability reporter, I am one person, I run a basically one person operation. And there's, you know, I think about like the county, King County has never gotten covered as much as it should. And now I feel like, you know, I hear about stories that just, you know, that I either can occasionally cover, but generally can't. And they just never get told. And I think there's a lot of accountability reporting that is just impossible to do when you have fewer people and less of a kind of, you know, farm team coming up from colleges with kids wanting to study journalism and seeing it as, you know, not a lucrative career, but at least a career. And, you know, kind of to your point, Hannah, there's a lot of, there's the PRization that you talked about, but there's also the social mediaization and the next doorization, and like people have, you know, the police blotter, and there's a lot of, you know, not to pick on the Seattle Times, but the Seattle Times will often, you know, if they cover certain stories, it's like police say that, you know, man running away was hold a gun or whatever, and I think that affects marginalized communities. So, so I guess my next question is, you know, when neighborhoods and communities lose beat reporters, but they gain all that stuff, how does that reshape the public narrative about local issues? And it could also be local arts as well, but the coverage of local arts is just so paltry now. I don't know if that question is apt for that.
Sorry, I think that part of what I find really interesting about the examples that you used there, the next door, the police blotter, it's not just like how it does impact the public perception of a neighborhood, right? Mostly because people no longer have access to that information at all. And for next door, for the police blotter, whatever, it means that the self-conception of that neighborhood can also radically change. And I think that's perhaps like the even most egregious part of that is that your own perception of like the community that you live in can get narrower and narrower and narrower.
Naomi or Florangela?
Sorry, can you restate the question?
Yeah, basically, how does it change, you know, the way that the public narrative about communities when the news about those communities, you know, A, is not coming from those communities, but B, is stuff like Nextdoor or, you know, or police blotter posts that show one perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that increase so much over the past few years, especially as the lines get more and more blurred between seeing something on Nextdoor, you see something on Citizen, or you see something on, you know, any number of these Ring apps or anything like that, and people don't have the media literacy skills, and hopefully we can talk about this a little bit more, to be able to discern what's the difference between something that's actually evidence-based and rooted in something that's been vetted and filtered through some kind of checks and balances versus something that is just someone saying, I saw this, I think this is what's happening, but you don't actually know what's happening. I mean, I think a really good example of that happened this week with the container ship, or the containers at the Port of Tacoma, that spelled out Renee, and that went all over my social media, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, look at this protest for Renee Good, and they felt it was pretty clear what it meant, but oftentimes, as we learn in journalism, it's very humbling. The thing that you think it might mean is often not the thing that it means, right? And I think the difference between social media and journalism is the journalist has to ask, and our reporter, Kai O'Hara, did this. He asked them, where did this come from and why? And when he did that, he found out that it was actually a birthday commemoration for someone's girlfriend's birthday who happened to be named Renee, right? It was an incredible coincidence, the timing, everything like that, but that's what journalism is, right? It's taking something you think to be true, but testing it and finding out, is it actually true? And I think that's the important role that we play and what we need to be doing. And I think people need to understand that that's something that they can also be doing when they're consuming things on social media and asking those questions as they see it.
I had a conversation not that long ago about, it was during the mayoral race, and I was talking to a former judge, and she was telling me a story about being in a room with people and talking about both candidates, wondering how they are, who they are, what they're like. And I thought, well, I'm going to all the debates. I'm going into the rooms because I want to see what Harold and Wilson are like. And I'm reading everything I can. And she said, well, that's different. You're atypical. You have that wired to ask questions and to try to get as close as possible to quote unquote reality so you could vet yourself. Most people don't. Most people will just turn to their neighbor or their family member and go, oh, I heard this. Or Naomi will say something and you take that as truth and that's it. I mean, Naomi's a bad example, but you know what I mean. The instinct that journalists...
I will say, I told my family that there was this protest about Renee because I saw someone send it to me. So I will admit, I spread misinformation this week. I feel terrible about it. I also shared the story we did about it to make up for it. But yeah, I spread misinformation this week. I'm very embarrassed about it.
But I think it's, that is why journalists are so important, because we are wired. We're trained. We are skeptical. We're used to asking questions. We will dig and dig and dig, and we want to make sure that what we say or pass on in our storytelling is accurate, or at least has the context and giving you the information. And I think that's what's missing, is if your source is next door, if your source is a simple Facebook post or a retweet or whatever it's called, you have to take a beat. You should take a beat and see who else is out there showing you saying things. I have so much skepticism about what I see on social media that I do really caution, I do really stop. And it's until if I know the reporter or I trust the source or both, and I see it repeated on my social media feed, then I will lean in and tend to believe that what I'm seeing or what I'm reading is true. And so I think that's the danger, is the fear that gets instilled if you're just getting it really quickly and from a source that is not a journalism site.
Yeah. I mean, this echoes a debate or an argument that I have in my household. Basically, starting 1 minute after I get up every morning, because we are a social media heavy household, and it is it's a lot of work. To your point, I mean, most people are not going to go and look at 17 different sources. So how do we sort of, as journalists, educate people about the difference between journalists and, somebody with a ring light, or somebody, barging into a press conference to make a scene for TikTok or whatever. Those are real examples. I mean, there are people who do that in the city of Seattle. In this time when people just are kind of looking at social media for information so much, how do we help people understand what journalism is and how it's different than that? And how is it different? I mean, maybe that would be a helpful place to start.
Well, I think the question of how it's different is part of the challenge there, because one of the problems with social media is that anybody can go on there and say that they're an independent journalist too. We see that a lot on the far right. And we see those narratives getting pushed by people who self-describe as journalists. There are people who have, a lot of people have been able to co-opt that job, explicit job description that we all carry. And I think that part of what is so, it kind of comes back to the importance of local news, is that, I don't know all of y'all's reading habits, but I do know that if you talk to people about national media, they've got opinions. If you talk to people about local media, they talk about whatever pub they read like it's their friend. And like the trust that people can cultivate with local media is completely different. And I think that it's because like that paper is writing about what's happening in front of them, and you're able to build a degree of trust that you can't necessarily build in a national publication. And I think it puts us in a really, like everybody on this stage right now, in a really, really important and powerful position to kind of build, maintain, and teach that trust and treat it with a lot of care.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important question, and such an important question right now. I think evidence-based journalism, which is what we're all trying to do here, is so foundational to our civic life, our democracy, everything that we need to be vigilant in protecting. But I think the lines are getting so blurred, social media and AI, and I think people aren't given any of the tools they need to have the kind of media literacy to understand what they're seeing, ask critical questions, have critical thinking, and be able to sort of vet any media source, whether it's a mainstream media source, alternative media source, whatever it might be, through this idea of what are you seeing, whose agenda could be behind it, what are some other ways of looking at the topic, whose voices are present, whose voices are missing. I mean, I think there's some basic things that have been kind of left out of our public conversation around how to consume media, and it's really past time that I think we start doing that more.
One thing we were experimenting and continue to is we have a media literacy columnist at the Emerald, for that very reason, is because it is a constant question that gets asked, and I think it's a very Seattle thing, which is asking about media literacy. How do we instill it? How do we pass it on? How do we learn from our children, or have the children learn that from us? To what Naomi was saying, the vetting, the context, people don't understand just the rigor that's involved in reporting. And I think that is the thing that's cautionary too, is if you're getting information, because that's what we're doing. We're in the business of passing on information. You are assuming that you can trust us. We should be able to tell you, or you should be able to glean where the information is coming from. That's transparency. That's the context that you deserve. You deserve to read a social media post or a story and walk away knowing where the sources, what are the sources of the information in that story, and where the information, and perhaps giving you an opportunity to go and dig and find out more. Because in this day and age, back to, I always take a beat. You can have, with AI, you could have somebody how do you know that Naomi's blue sky is actually Naomi's? How do you know that the social media, like the power of eyewitness, you want to see that video yourself? Well, how do you know that video hasn't been altered? How do you know the one news source hasn't been hacked, or hasn't, in the quest to be first, been so aggressive and push out information and then have to backtrack? And where at what point are you going to get into that discussion and realize that they made a mistake earlier? Where I thought you were going with the Renee, because I thought the same thing. I didn't push it out, but I did think the same thing. Like, oh, look, Renee. I'm like, wow, in Tacoma, really?
Yeah. To be fair, the longshore workers also said that it was what it was, but it wasn't. So.
But was the it was unconfirmed reports of ICE, and Seattle Public Schools had the shelter in place. Unconfirmed reports instituted a whole action that instilled a lot of fear in a lot of people, and there was reporting in the media about that. And that goes back to you should be able to go to the beginning of a story of information and find out where that information originated from. That is the literacy that I think we all need to start practicing and push back on, and also understanding the vetting that comes in, because it's so many people think that it's the one byline or the publication, but there is so much context, so much vetting, the editor, the stuff that was left out, the caption, who wrote the caption, who's writing the social media post, is that the reporter? So I think all of that the sausage making of journalism, I think, is a really important thing for people to understand.
Yeah, and I think the point about rigor is really important. I think people get frustrated when they say, oh, well, you haven't reported this thing out, but I've already seen it all over social media, right? And that's because the rigor part is happening behind the scenes that you're not seeing. And it's no virtue to be first and wrong. It's a virtue to be maybe slower and accurate, right? And I think that's what people are seeing things in social media a lot faster than the media is putting it together, journalists are putting it together, and there's a reason for that. And sometimes the stuff that you're seeing on social media that comes out lightning fast turns out to be true, but too often it's not, right? And so many problems happen, and so many lives can be seriously harmed in that rush to being out there first. And there's unfortunately, a lot of media outlets that will just run with that. And I think the ones that are responsible will take a beat and do the rigor that Florangela's talking about.
I think the question that I'm still struggling with around this, though, is then, like, I would hazard a guess that everyone in this room does have a handle of what the rigor of journalism is, like why it's distinct from a social media post. But I do think we also have a very digital first generation coming up that doesn't have this, speaking to your point about media literacy, how do we, I don't think we have a clear plan for how to teach media literacy to an entire generation.
I think you're right.
And I think that, that's the thing that I've been struggling with when we, we have I think all of our publications have a strong social media presence, and we'll also see, those rumors get popped up, why aren't you reporting on this? The same issues that you guys are all talking about. And our social media editor has gone in occasionally to be like, this is how reporting works. In case you were wondering, we're working on it. But we can't, that only reaches so much of an audience. I don't know, have you guys seen any successful models for talking to 20-year-olds about how to take media in?
What's been the feedback to your column, Florangela?
We're trying to get it into a stronger cadence, and I think people are liking it. And we're really happy that we're experimenting with that. The byline is, the reporter is a Renton librarian whose specialty is that. But we have such a force in terms of literacy and disinformation, misinformation at the UW. And I think, to your point, Hannah, I think it goes, I don't spend a lot of time on TikTok, but I do think the curiosity of the younger generation of getting information out and witnessing things, I do think the engagement that's there, the pushback, I think that is an opportunity, because people are going to ask the question or wonder, well, why does Naomi have that information? Like, what was the access? What is she seeing that somebody else isn't seeing? What is her perspective? Is there somebody else who was in that same room, or is there a different interview that happened, and did somebody else have a different lens? And I think there is opportunity there. I get encouraged by, I know you started with this notion of, and it's true, the shrinking newsrooms, we know what's happened here locally, but I do think that creates opportunity. You're a perfect example of what you've been able to do in your success. I would say the credibility, the rigor that you practice with things that have shut down or the dwindling. I think there's opportunity for new things, and that's the part that keeps me encouraged, is there probably is and are. I mean, we've seen some of that in the last year.
Yeah, and I want to say, I think social media can be journalism. I don't want to be a gatekeeper, because I am the one sitting up here who has a one-person operation. So the rigor is internal. I hold myself accountable, and also I don't want to get sued, right? So and I have training in legacy, alt weekly media at least. That's what I did before starting Publicola. But I don't want to be too much of a gatekeeper on what is media, but I think you have to apply the same lens to everything. Even if it's a 30-second TikTok, there needs to be citation of sources. I would love to see more actual journalism happening on. I'm not on TikTok either. It drives me insane. Just the algorithm drives me insane. But on Instagram, whatever your social media preference is, I would like to see the sort of work of journalism happening, like interviews, things like that, quick hits. It doesn't, we don't have to expect people, like, I love the written word. I want people to read a 10,000 word story that I've written, but that's not realistic for the vast majority of people, even though, like, I might have spent months on that story. But I think that there does have to be some literacy around, understanding who people are as you're scrolling past them, understanding what the requirements of journalism are, and that's just, pursuing the truth, reporting facts, not reporting things that aren't facts yet, reconfirming things with other people. There's just stuff that that everybody does at a baseline level if you're a journalist, no matter what medium you're doing it on, and even if it is like, a 30-second video. So I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts on that, but I just wanted to I'm feeling a little crusty up here, talking about about print media.
No.
What I was going to say in terms of that is a good point about your training and your background, is that's probably the thing that I wrestle with when I see a lot of the newer streams of information, is the rigor that I see missing is there an editor? Like, is it just somebody who's standing and saying, I'm here, and then they're telling you, they're just spouting off. One, I don't know how interesting you are, and I don't know if I like what you're saying. What is your lens exactly? But two, the heft, the muscle that an editor has to push back on content or video or a crop of a photo, to check a reporter for their own blind spots, to look at nuance and context, and is that the right word that you want to use, to think about the audience and how the audience is going to consume that, where they are, to think of what else is happening in the world at that moment, and it's a taste thing as well. All of those things that an editor and a copy editor can help make that story stronger. And so that's the part that I think is missing in social media. Sometimes it feels a little too thin.
It's missing from a lot of regular media now too. I mean, I feel
So
like that's
true.
what gets cut at newsrooms now, because there's this sense that, like, we don't need editors anymore, and we certainly don't need copy editors. I mean, typos might just be like little annoying things, but it depreciates the quality of the product. But yeah, I mean, I have a volunteer editor, my co-founder of Publicola, but I struggle with that, and I just think the decimation of editors at publications has been a huge, kind of almost invisible problem.
I always like to talk about journalism as a team sport, that there is always a byline, but we do this work because we like to play a team sport. But I think that when it comes to changing the format, that's where if you think about moving journalism into social media, we've done this many times over. We've figured out how to do this same thing in radio and the same thing on television, and I think it's about we all have this agreed upon set of rules that we play by, and that's why we know how we can trust each other and trust the work that each of these publications does, and I think that because the barrier to entry is so low with social media, it's the question we have is, how do you prove that you're playing by those rules and show people that you're playing by those rules? And right now, the only thing that we have is saying that you're attached to a publication that does journalism. But I would love. I think we need to explore ways to communicate that better, because I think it will help people understand what it is about journalism that makes it important.
And I think there's been some forays into that. I mean, I think there's been efforts to kind of have some kind of pledge or commitment to society professional journalist principles or something like that, right? But it's always kind of been in fits and starts. And just to follow up on something that Flora said, I think the other thing that I think about social media is it's not necessarily the platform, it's whether or not the sort of checks and balances that I think we all value really highly are in play, right? And they can be in play on any platform, but I think what they're often missing on social media. And so to your point, I think in addition to having some trail of where did you get the information, I think there's also this facet of accountability and transparency when you make a mistake, right? So I always look to, when I'm trying to see if whether or not a publication is reliable or not, it's what's their corrections policy, because every one of us knows that there's no media outlet in the world that doesn't make a mistake at some point, right? Do they own the mistake? Are they transparent about the mistake? Are they honest about it? Is there a way to even see that's even happened, right? And if there's none of that, then that tells you something, right? And I think that's something we also need to be paying attention to.
I think, one element of, I guess filtering out, social media, or people, not to pick on social media, but, just people who are sort of, non-traditional journalists versus, like, let's say provocateurs is, is are you able to make a living at it? I mean, like, let's say it is journalism, right? Like, let's stipulate you're doing journalism, whatever platform. I mean, people are not going to keep doing social media posts forever, or, a million vertical videos unless they're able to make a living at it. And, like, sometimes you do that by being a provocateur, but in our area, I think that the pivots you were talking about, Hannah, like, the pivot to video that happened with Facebook, and now everybody's doing vertical videos, and, like, and I personally hate that, but, like, next, in 5 years, it's going to be something else, right? So,
5 years? Give it 5 months. Kidding
yeah,
me?
I mean, sure, like, right, it could be, and and it's AI, and so, I mean, is there a way for us as journalists and publications to sort of, demonstrate our value to people in a way that doesn't just, that we're not just rewarding the algorithm that feeds the AI that everybody's reading? Like, how can we demonstrate that, like, we human, flesh sacks sitting up here have value?
I just want to shout out print media for this. I thank you, whoever you are. Thank you guys too.
I'm keeping the magazine industry alive, like, single-handedly in my house. So
Excellent. No, I think that print media. There's something so special about something that just doesn't have to navigate the algorithm. And, like, there's something about 2026 that seems to be, like, analog is calling to people, and it makes me really happy. But there is, like, one thing that I hadn't thought about, like, as we at The Stranger returned to, like, a consistent print cadence, is that there is this one thing that we do where we don't have to think about SEO or the algorithm at all. It is, like, we just have to produce something of quality. And I think there's something to physical media that, we all like to hold something in our hands. And it's not a solution to the algorithm-based competition. But it does hold, I think, a really special place in the media sphere. And I think it's becoming especially apparent as the AI algorithms are getting more and more nightmarish.
anybody else?
I mean, I think we need to do a better job of telling that story for the public, and I mean, I guess that's kind of what we're doing here now. But I think that it's become so. Social media in particular, and the algorithms that you're talking about, are so all-consuming, and everything's happening so lightning fast. And with AI and the way in which these tech companies have really created an incentive structure that really rewards this extreme polarization, rewards this like and dislike culture, I think that it makes it even more imperative that we talk about what differentiates the work that we do versus the work that we're seeing happening in Meta and other platforms. And I think we can't have that conversation enough, because there's so much that rides on it. There's so much that depends on it. It's not just me being nostalgic for the golden era of journalism or anything like that. There's like real things at play, people's lives, what they know about their communities, how they know it. It really, really matters. The work that we do really, really matters, and I think we need to take it really seriously. We need to talk to people about why, the consumption of evidence-based journalism in the public interest is a value that is something that we should be sharing and spreading.
So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the anxiety that we're all feeling is a special moment for journalism. because you can find examples of how to counter that. You can see what your neighbors are doing. You can hold your local electeds accountable. You can find out about who's doing what in your community. You can find, right? You can reward yourself with whatever it is that you're interested in and are curious about. But I think that, to Naomi's point, we don't tell you enough about who we are and why we do what we do. We don't pull back the curtain enough to tell you our ethics. And I think that is a differentiation, too, between print or traditional media or trained media or however you want to label, because there's it's a big community. But at its core, there's a reason for what we do. And I think, for me, the power is always the ethics. And we don't do a good job of letting you all in so that you can then assess, I like that information, or, oh, I see where she's coming from, but I don't know if I trust that, right? Because all of us, frankly, we all have lenses. We all grew up in a certain way. We all live a certain way. We all like things and don't like things. And Naomi and I we could go to a story, the same event, and come out of it and have seen two different things, right? The audience is the third one. Who are you going to believe? And I think what the takeaway is, you get to know Naomi, get to know what she does, what she acknowledges, where she goes, where her comfort zone is, what she's going to ignore, and then continue to trust Naomi, and then you build that relationship. But we don't do a good job as news organizations or journalists to kind of create that. The thing that I struggle with, frankly, is it's a really simple thing, but a really powerful thing. I want to have emails for all my contributors, right, and myself on the website. It should be a no-brainer. You should be able to email. The hell that happens if you put your email, not just because of, legitimate comments, but imagine, I see that all the time, and I'm always curious about what stories in the Times when there's comments or not comments, but then the spam and the bots and the phishing, the hacking, the security, right? That is a big thing that is happening now in journalism circles, is how do you protect the safety of journalists? When you want to build that trust and be transparent and be available to readers and your audience, and at the same time, we're enemies, we're targets, we are victims of harassment. And so how do we protect ourselves and how do we protect our teams of people? That's the thing. If you go to the Emerald, you'll see that it's a struggle to figure out the contact information, and that's part of it.
That's so interesting. I mean, I also, I've had my share of harassment and threats and things like that. But I put my cell phone number out there. I tell people, if you want to hit me up on Signal, here's my literal cell phone number that goes to this phone. And I put my email out there too. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm going to get harassed no matter what.
The safety trainers will tell you not to do that.
Of course they will. Of course they will. But, it's just a different, it just depends on sort of your level of, I guess, tolerance for that kind of BS, and it's usually mostly BS. It's verbal harassment, it's people sending you harassing emails. But I also I just have this kind of weird woo-woo trust in the universe approach, because I've tried everything else and nothing else has worked, unfortunately, to prevent it. So,
but I would say you're also seasoned and you're tough. And
that's
I think,
true. I'm not saying anybody should ever have to put up with any
No,
of that.
but the fear that I have, and this is because I've managed newsrooms, and I work with a lot of younger journalists or journalists newer to the profession, and that my stress is through the roof thinking about the vulnerability they have in trying to send them, and let alone when you think of what is happening elsewhere, and if that happens here, and the harm that could happen, the physical harm, and how do you do that?
I'm the wrong one here.
But I think
just my approach.
To Flora's point, I think this is something that I think about a lot, and I do a lot of work in this arena, both as someone who's a recipient of that kind of hate, but also as someone who is a leader in a newsroom, who this is a huge source of concern for us and something we prioritize really strongly. And one of the things that, is true about it is that for women and people of color, and particularly women of color, they're much more likely to be targeted in this way. And the impact on journalism is devastating when, as to Flora's point, like when young people of color, young women of color decide that it's not worth getting up in the morning to be treated like you're the enemy when you're only trying to do your job, and then be subjected to racist and sexist and homophobic vitriol. It's just, there's lots of other things you could be doing with your life, right? So that's a real threat to journalism when that kind of thing is left unchecked. And we haven't figured out how to maintain that level of transparency that you're talking about, as well as protecting the people, but we try to find a balance, but it's really hard. And the extreme level, the temperature of it is so extreme right now that I can understand why a young person might be like, yeah, no, this isn't worth it to me, and we got to do whatever we can to make sure that they don't make that calculation.
I just think if you're on social media, like, you're unfortunately exposed, whether you're a young person or an older person, you're opening yourself up. Yes, I am saying this as like a somewhat grizzled veteran of, of social media harassment campaigns and stuff like that. I don't think anybody should have to go through that at all, but I don't know what the solution is, or if there's a solution other than like changing society, changing people's hearts. Better information, more media maybe is part of the solution. I
want to really lean into what is most comfortable for the person. So yeah. I think if that's taking their email off because they're being subjected to a whole bunch of hate or whatever it might be, but whatever is most comfortable for the person.
I think that's great. I remember being at The Stranger and like it was impossible. And this is way before you, Hannah, like decades before. But I remember it being impossible to take down harassing comments. And that was just like part of and I was a young woman at the time, and I was just told that's just part of your job. And, and so I think there's, extreme examples, particularly early in the internet, where we just didn't know how harmful it was.
Banning abusive comments is one of my favorite games I play on my lunch break.
Well, I moderate my own comments. So I'm like, why would you think that I would approve this comment, about what a terrible person I am? I've read it, congratulations, but nobody else is going to, so. Just a reminder to folks, if you want to use the QR code to submit comments, please do so. We're going to go to audience questions in just a few minutes. I want to touch on one thing that comes up again and again, and it's priority of our new mayor, actually, is finding a way to fund media. Everyone's experimenting with different business models. There's nonprofits, there's the Seattle Times family-owned newspaper, there's a Stranger, which is
funded by every possible route that we could figure out.
Which is a vastly expanding media empire. And then there's me, I'm a little for-profit. Are we struggling because we haven't found the right business model yet? Or is it because we're trying to fund a public good like it's a product?
I think the audience just answered that. So you're nodding to kind of the journalism version of the democracy voucher program, which may or may not come into existence in the next couple years, next couple decades, someone's lifetime. It is the idea behind it, though, is that journalism is a public good, which is, I think, a really valuable way to think about the work that we do. It's also how we think about public media. And we see where we're at with that right now. I do think that it is part of at least previous versions of this country to imagine media as a public good. For some reason, it's always kind of skirted print media and written media. And I think that's where a program like this would address that big gap. I do think we probably need to fund public broadcasting again first before we could get through something like that.
Why not both?
Please.
I think yes, that is part of what's happening. I think we haven't really made the value proposition that needs to be made to the public as to why this is a public good and why it's something that they should be prioritizing and valuing. I get a lot of folks in my own, community who balk at paywalls, and I get it. It's frustrating to hit a paywall, but they hit other paywalls all the time. They just don't think of it that way. Like they hit a paywall at Netflix and they pay the bill for Netflix, right? But they hit a paywall when they want to buy a ticket to an event, but they buy a ticket to that event, right? But when it comes to journalism, which we have over 100 people who are producing journalism every day, that's something that is seen as an unfair burden, and I get it. It's affordability is a real issue, but I think it's about what we value and what we prioritize. I want to see all local media survive. I try to support as many local media outlets as I possibly can because I think we're better off the more outlets there are, the more voices we are. I think we were better off when we had 2 alternative news weeklies.
Absolutely.
I think we were better off when we had 2 newspapers. I think, I miss the magazine. I used to run Colors Northwest. I miss City Arts. I miss all the things that made our civic dialogue richer. But for the Seattle Times, I think one of the things that we've been able to do is really kind of grow our coverage through community-funded labs, which is kind of a hybrid of what we've just been talking about. And so we've been able to add an education lab, traffic lab, climate lab, homelessness lab, mental health lab, and those are community funded with a huge firewall between the folks that fund it and the coverage that we do. But that's been able to increase. We have about 25% of our staff funded through those community labs, and they've been able to do coverage that has really been groundbreaking and a huge public service to the community. So I think there's no one answer. I think to Hannah's point, it's going to take every possible avenue. But I do think that communication to the public is something that I hope we can be doing more of, just to say, why is this work important? How do you rely on it? How do you know what you know? I think about that all the time. How do you know what you know? Like people who say, we don't need print media, we don't need all these things, we can just use, whoever I trust on TikTok to tell me what's going on in the world. But how do you know what you know? And how do you know that they know what they know, What's the evidence behind it? And I think when you start to drill down, to Florangela's point, there's a rigor behind what I think we all do, and I think that rigor is really important.
I used to do some event planning, and we would talk about whether or not we would have to charge, just a minimum $5, because if you didn't charge an admission fee, the likelihood was that people weren't going to show up. You didn't want to have a free event. I run a news organization where we're really proud that we don't have paywalls. We want to make it accessible to anybody. We think information is yours to have, but I want to have a free news source with the expectation is what you just read cost money to produce. I want to pay freelancers a living wage. I want to have original photography for every story. And I want to have a reel to share on social media because our audiences are different. And I'm aware that some people spend time and want newsletters emailed to them. And another demographic likes to live on social media. And another demographic might like to just come to the website. So I want people to pay us. You come in, it's free, but then you leave and you're like, that was so good. I'm gonna give you $5. That's, I'm just gonna give you a little tip jar. And so that's what I want, which is why I will be leaving this postcard, because we're fundraising for our very first full-time reporter. The Emerald has never had a full-time reporter, believe it or not. People always think that we're staffed, and we have this huge staff, and if you go to our About page, you see a lot of people, but everybody on there, except for 2 of us, is a contractor or a freelancer. And so after 12 years serving the South End, we are on a mission to have a full-time reporter, paying them a living wage to live in Seattle. That is our goal. And I think we're never gonna have a paywall. Thank you. But we think media deserves to be paid for because it is work. And who does work for free? That is not the case if you want to live in Seattle. And so you should be subscribing to the Seattle Times, subscribe to The Stranger, subscribe to Publicola, subscribe to all the other media outlets that exist in Seattle, because again, to Naomi's point, the city is better with more and more as many news outlets as possible. That is the strength of Seattle, and it's important for all of us.
I have one last question before we go to audience questions. And, since we're all of us up here, I think are not in a position where we have to claim to be objective reporters, we'll sort of toss aside the concept of objectivity and stipulate that it doesn't exist. We're all subjective human beings writing through our own lenses and with our own experiences coming to the table. What I want to know, one thing with Publicola that I think of myself as having is a mission. I won't go into, I'm the moderator here, I won't go into a spiel about my mission, but you can tell what it is when you read the site. But I want to ask you guys if you think that you have a mission, either as a publication or a columnist, in the work that you do every day.
Yeah. When you first brought up the idea of objectivity, I think that anyone here who's read The Stranger knows that we throw that out, that concept out the window pretty fast. But I think what we take a lot of pride in is that by doing that, we're able to get at a bigger truth. And I think that what drives us is the idea that, in choosing to tell a story in a intentionally unobjective, intentionally maybe bucking some conventions of traditional journalism while still doing the reporting rigor that we've all agreed that we do, that we can get at this greater truth, and that is always the goal of the work that we do. And I think that's our North Star, and it makes it a lot easier to show up to work every day.
Yeah, as a social justice columnist, I think my mission is pretty much in my title, but I try to, as much as possible, center the margins in our communities and make sure that folks that have often felt like their voices haven't been heard are centered in a way that is sometimes hopefully instructive for the rest of the community to learn from. So that's kind of my personal mission, but I think to your point, I really believe no matter what kind of journalism you do, whether you're a columnist or a reporter or whatever you might be, those same principles of being evidence-based and rigorous and transparent and accountable and fair as much as you possibly can apply, right? Just because I'm a columnist doesn't mean I can say whatever I want and just use whatever facts I want and not have to have any consequences for that, right? I'm subject to the same exact rules that everyone else is on that front, and I should be, and you should hold everyone to that standard as well, no matter what kind of journalism they're doing. So I think that's really important for anyone who's consuming media to be holding whoever they're consuming it from to those standards.
We are very much rooted in social justice. We were founded as an alternative to legacy media. We were founded from the perspective that there is a lot happening in South Seattle, in the South End, that is overlooked or ignored, dismissed. And the reality that we experience as residents and people who work there is not the reality that we see portrayed elsewhere. We are very much aligned with what Naomi was saying in terms of centering the historically marginalized. We're unabashedly proud of being South Seattle. That objectivity is out the window. We are really proud of who we are, what we're about, and we're driven to just find the truth of our communities and include as many voices as possible and elevate what people are experiencing, what is on people's minds, and at the same time looking to greater Seattle and looking to powerful institutions or individuals and making sure that they are being mindful of who we are and all the complexity, because we are not a monolith, and that's a whole nother discussion that we could have.
And I will just, the one thing I will say is, I also am not remotely objective. I come out of the alt weekly world. I worked at The Stranger for a long time, worked at the other alt weekly that used to be here before that, and then in Texas before that. But my goal is always to be fair, and part of being fair, I mean, even if the subjects of my stories don't like the story, which they often don't, it's always talking to both sides, and if that means, calling the police officers guild, which I know, some people might not, who are politically left-leaning like me, might not want to do that. I don't always want to. I mean, I actually like calling people who I disagree with, but it means being fair and giving both opportunities, both sides of an issue or all sides of an issue, to whatever extent is possible, an opportunity to tell their version of the truth, and then in so doing get at your version of the real truth. So I don't believe in one-sided stories. So I'm going to ask some audience questions that have come up through the app, and I believe there is also a microphone somewhere. There it is. If people want to come to the microphone to ask a question, my only request is please actually ask a question and keep it concise so that our panelists can get to more questions. So I'm going to start with one from the app. A viewer asks, I'm leading a workshop at Nathan Hale High School in a couple weeks covering media literacy and current events. Any recommendations for a local news topic I should bring to have students analyze for bias from either or both sides of the political spectrum?
First of all, yay for doing that.
Any of the issues that were centered on our most recent election, I feel would be fascinating to explore. I think housing and home, just taking a moment to look at 4 different articles describing the same policy change in our housing, public housing models, would be fascinating if you're into that kind of stuff, which maybe high schoolers aren't.
Trying to think of things that would be interesting to high schoolers.
Here's one. What about this is a little while ago, but the event on May Day where a group of anti-trans, a Christian church that was promoting an explicitly anti-trans agenda, did a rally and an event at Cal Anderson Park in the middle of Capitol Hill. And that got a lot of coverage, and I bet it got a lot of coverage from a lot of different angles with various
That's
a good one.
and biases.
Yeah, just an analysis of those headlines would be fascinating.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Grace. I'll keep my question brief. I'm a UW student, and I was just wondering a little bit about the realities of journalism. You've mentioned that there's been a shift in technique, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what the difference is in the boots on the ground journalistic technique that you're applying in the culture of social media, or if you've noticed a difference in peer or similarly aligned journalistic entities, if that makes sense.
I wouldn't say I've noticed a difference in technique from our publications. I think what we were more talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, is that there's a kind of a whole new cadre of folks that are producing content without really producing journalism, but it's being produced under the sort of moniker or guise of journalism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was making sense. I was just more asking what you guys are doing to combat that shift, if there was any action you guys were taking on your end on that front.
Yeah, I think that there is a really interesting, social media is a feedback loop that we have now as journalists, and that's something that we do need to, it does create an interesting source of how many times have you guys, I think the Renee thing was a really good example of that. That triggered an exploration into a story. I think that we have, it is, I think, a really unique source of really, really fallible information, but it tells us a lot about what our audience or what our readers might be encountering. And so I think it helps drive what misinformation we're fighting. So I think it does really help guide a lot of what our service reporting is, at least for us, because we know what we're up against, I think, in terms of bad information.
So kind of like what not to do sort of thing, or?
No, like what narrative we're trying to correct. If we're seeing, like I think a good example I think is a lot of the reports that we've seen throughout the city that have, like, on social media, they've blown up that, like, ICE is here in this particular location, that, like, we actually do have the tools to verify whether or not that's true sometimes. And being able to, like, that is a public service that we can do to engage and ask and figure out whether or not there's ICE agents at a particular hotel or whatever it is. And I think it does guide a lot of what we understand to be kind of that service journalism that we can do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next audience question.
Hi, thank you for coming here. I was wondering what relevance, if any, literary skills have in modern print journalism.
Do you mean like being able to write well?
More than just the craft of prose, I'm thinking about some Stranger articles in particular from maybe the early 2010s, like the Bravest Woman in Seattle, I think what it was called. Really ambitious writing projects as well as solid journalism. And I'm wondering about the role of that.
Yeah, for context, the one Pulitzer, The Stranger, won. I think that there are papers that are writers' papers. There are papers that, like, celebrate voice and celebrate narrative, and those papers and those magazines absolutely still exist. And I think that there exists, I would guess for you guys, like, places within, even if typically you write hard news, places where that writing is still really celebrated. I think it's really context-based. I think that there are places where that kind of narrative writing plays such an important tool in conveying, role in conveying information. And I think in newsrooms, we opt in and out of that. It's really hard work to do that kind of work, but it pays off sometimes.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, that kind of narrative writing can appear in any kind of story, in any kind of publication. We have a couple writers, David Gutman and Brendan Kiley, who come to mind at the Seattle Times, who I think do a beautiful job of that. I mean, they can do that for an obit, they could do that for a story about, I guess, what was it, wind? What was it, wind? Wind, oh, just about wind, yes. Yeah, so I mean, it's just having that sort of mindset, and also having the space and the editors who can say, okay, no, you don't have to fit into this one little box. You can actually spread your wings and fly a little bit and try something new and do something a little bit different, and it's okay, and it's actually great, and we love it, and that's part of your special gift.
There's also long-form audio and podcasting. A lot of people forget how much writing is involved in radio, in documentary, and I think there is room, if prose is what you love, if you're comfortable with words that may not exist in print, you can find avenues for that. People crave good stories. People crave good information. People crave reality and character and hope, and they want all the emotion that prose offers. So I would think that journalism can be the recipient of that, but there are different opportunities within that.
Thank you.
I want to ask a quick lightning round question to steal a term from debates from an audience member. Just real quick, can you describe your daily media consumption habits?
Well, before, a few months ago, I would have said not TikTok, but now I would say TikTok. No, I would say I read, like, pretty much everyone here, from Publicola to The Stranger, plus the New York Times, Washington Post, all the other local media, whatever I can. I'm trying to get better about paying attention to broadcasts, local broadcasts, but I often forget to do that, but I'm trying to get better at that, because tons and tons of people are seeing their media through those platforms, and it matters. I listen to KOW all the time, probably too much. Yeah, see what else. And then, of course, all the other online type digital publications, the 19th, I love the 19th, Capital B, national ones like that.
Ditto, for the most part. I think that you're going to find, I mean, hopefully, I'm assuming we all read an unreasonable amount of news. I have recently, in the new year, I'm not a New Year's resolutions person, but I've like really gotten my scrolling in check, and I'm very proud of myself for that. And I have found that like it has changed how I encounter information. And so that, I think that's been really interesting. Like I don't see what people are like picking up in the zeitgeist in the same way. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. But my brain feels healthier, so that's good. But I think that I think we all run through the local media. We run through like the big legacy media. My special little corner is that I still read a lot of New York-based media because I lived there for 15 years, and it's fun to get a little taste. I find that it's a really nice way to still stay connected to old homes. So,
Honestly, my media diet has shifted. I'm about to complete a year at the Emerald, and so my world has gotten much smaller in the sense of what I really care about is what's happening in my neighborhood. I want to spend time in third places and engaging in conversation and understanding what's happening with neighbors. It's made me healthier. I listen to a lot less network news than I did a couple years ago when I had a different job. But to Hannah's point, I also consume a lot of LA media. That's where I'm from and my roots. And I'm a former immigration reporter, and I am obsessed with a lot of the independent outlets in LA and how they've been covering the issue. And to me, that is really exciting and energizing to see how small, hyper-local newsrooms can thrive, because that's very much what the Emerald is about. And so it's encouraging to me.
Thanks.
And I read Publicola. I do.
And I just want to shout out RSS readers. I'm like the last remaining holdout, but they're just a great way to read because I consume like way more media than any human being should. But the only way to do it for me is like having it all in one place. And yeah, it's a great technology for that. I sound like I'm supporting the Betamax or something, but I swear it's incredible if you just set it up and do it. So yes.
Hi, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I worked in local radio and television for about half a century, and so it's a really changed landscape today. So I just thought of I used to have lunch sometimes with the president of King Broadcasting, Ansel Payne, and he always he always asked about the same question, made the same commentary. I think it's appropriate. I'd love to hear your answers to it. He said, the essential foundation of a democracy is an informed citizenry. And in 2026, I'm interested in what you folks think is the best path to get an informed citizenry, the citizenry that chooses our leaders, chooses really, in a sense, with those votes where we're going.
Anybody want to take a bite of that?
I don't know if this is an answer to this question, but I did want to just sort of name a few things that I meant to name in this conversation, which is that, communities that lose local media, they have lower voter participation, they have fewer people running for office, they have more incumbents winning elections, they have fewer people engaged in civic discourse, and the direct impact is really stark when communities lose local media. And so I think we need to be really vigilant about exactly that point, because we're seeing the impacts of this democracy under threat, and that's, this informed public is a critical bulwark against that.
Yeah, I think that kind of to your point, one of the things that I think gets lost in the conversation of the escalation of social media as a source of information, as if it's this unstoppable force, forgetting that it happened simultaneously with the wildly defunding of local media across the board. That it wasn't that that social media quashed local media and that like people are choosing it. In a lot of cases, it's what they have. And so to your point, like investing in local media and keeping it present is one of the most valuable ways that we can maintain a informed citizenry that chooses our leaders.
And a media that really is connecting to so many of the different sectors of our communities. You know, I am hyper-local and focused, and yet I see so many gaps of what we can't get to when it comes to language, for example. And you think about Seattle and how robust it is and how beautiful it is in terms of the many different cultures and language, and you think about what is their news sources and who are the people from the communities who are able to deliver news in that realm. What about people who aren't literate? Where's the broadcasting that is provided for that? And again, to think about what keeps me encouraged is, you know, Jaime Mendez, for example. That, I think, is a really good example of you lose Spanish language local news on the one hand, and then you have Jaime stepping up and generating and providing really important information to Spanish-speaking audience via social media. That is also one of the things that I consume. I think that, to me, is just the constant, what we need to keep supporting and insisting on, that there is media and trusted information for our neighbors, not just ourselves.
Thank you. All right, and I think final question.
Jaime Mendez in the house.
Oh, you're here. Everybody should go talk to Jaime and follow him on social media.
Thank you all so much for making time today and connecting with us. I'm Marianne. I work at Real Change News. Thank you. And my question is kind of in the context of someone who's an editor who's also young. And I'm curious about what are your methods of ensuring that young journalists of color are gaining reporting experiences in Seattle, of course?
Well, this is one of my methods, is this postcard with the QR code on the back. No, seriously, it's so nice, the Nathan Hale student and then the UW student and you, Marianne, that when we were talking about media literacy and if there needs to be a program, how much high school journalism is no longer present, right? You don't have high school newspapers, you don't have high school journalism classes and outlets. And if we don't have that in schools, then that is one less door that is available to people to get that spark and be encouraged to follow this as a profession. I think every one of us is hopeful. We just want to grow our news organizations. We just need the resources so that we can bring more people in. And we're well aware that our newsrooms are much stronger and more powerful if we're reflecting the communities at large. And so I would say what we're doing is the Emerald, that is our mission, to make sure that we continue to reflect South Seattle. And so we're doing the work every day.
And I would just say one of my other hats is that I'm the president of the Asian American Journalists Association Seattle chapter, and as part of that we have the Northwest Journalists of Color Scholarship Program that is designed exactly to do what you're talking about, which is not just provide scholarship but also provide mentorship and sort of community building for journalists of color who are just getting started and need to have that kind of networking. They might not know any journalists. They might not know anybody who's ever been in journalism. That's how I was when I was that age. So it's a really good program, and we're about to award our this year's cohort of awardees, and really excited to see their future success. I received that scholarship when I was in high school and college, and it made a huge difference in my life. And I think the more we provide those opportunities for young people, the better this whole ecosystem will be.
I also think, and I'm sure that both of you can also relate to this, that the role of mentorship has kind of shifted a little bit because newsrooms are smaller. We don't have as much room for cub reporters to come in and learn on the job. So you kind of have to translate some of that mentorship energy into freelancers and people who really want to be in this universe. Because if you only have 3 staff writers, that only gives you so many opportunities to share the knowledge that we need to keep passing down if we want this industry to keep existing. And I think that finding other ways to mentor young journalists and to make space for journalists who you're working with to maybe not know everything and have that be okay and teach is a really, really important part of the work that we're doing right now. So.
Thank you so much.
All right, I think that does it for the panel. I want to thank our 3 panelists. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you all.